Some houses keep their secrets sealed behind plaster and pine. And some secrets, once uncovered, cannot be buried again. It was the spring of 1869 when a merchant out of Philadelphia purchased what the deed described as a fully functioning agricultural estate, situated in the lowlands of South Carolina. 1,600 acres of field, timber, and still water, priced far below any comparable property in that county. The seller, a man who had inherited the land from his father and his father's father before him, put his name to the papers without ceremony, without a trace of sentiment, and without a single backward glance at the house. He simply walked away. The new owner, a practical sort by nature, arrived at Harlow Hall accompanied by a surveyor, a carpenter, and a clear ambition to transform the estate into something modern, something that would bear no resemblance to what it once had been. But within 3 weeks of his arrival, the carpenter refused to continue. He quit without offering any explanation. The only thing he would say, quietly, to anyone who pressed him, was that there were things inside those walls no Christian man should ever have to lay eyes on. What those things were, and what they meant, took nearly 4 years to fully comprehend. And when the truth finally came to light, it did not arrive as a revelation. It came as a reckoning. Before we continue with the story of Harlow Hall, if you're new here, I want to welcome you. This channel exists to explore the darkest, most forgotten corners of American history, the stories that were buried, sealed away, and left to rot in silence. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. And leave a comment telling us where you're listening from tonight. To understand what was uncovered inside those walls, you first have to understand what Harlow Hall had once been. The property sat roughly 30 miles inland from the Carolina coast, far enough from Charleston's genteel streets to remain insulated from scrutiny, yet close enough to the port to have once profited enormously from the trade it enabled. The land had remained in the Harrove family since 1791, when a man named Edmund Harrove received it as partial payment for a debt owed to him by a Crown loyalist fleeing north after the Revolution. Edmund had not been born into wealth. He had been born into ambition, which, in the American South of that era, was often a far more dangerous inheritance. By the time Edmund's grandson, Nathaniel Harrove, took over the estate in 1841, Harlow Hall had grown from a rough-timbered farmhouse into something far more imposing. The main house rose 3 stories above the flat Carolina earth, with wide verandas wrapping the first 2 floors and a cupola at its peak that could be seen from the road nearly a mile off. The exterior was painted white, obsessively refreshed year after year, so that it gleamed in the summer heat like something trying far too hard to appear clean. Between 40 and 60 enslaved people worked the property, their numbers shifting with the rhythms of the rice and indigo trade. By the 1850s, the Harrove operation had shifted largely to rice, a crop that required not just labor, but specific knowledge. Knowledge that the enslaved people on the property possessed in abundance, having brought the techniques of tidal irrigation with them from the coast of West Africa over the preceding generations. The irony, understood by no one at the time, and acknowledged by almost no one afterward, was that Harlow Hall's prosperity rested entirely on expertise its owners could never have replicated on their own. Nathaniel Harrove, by the accounts that survived him, was a methodical man. He kept ledgers. He recorded transactions with the precision of a merchant rather than the looseness of a plantation aristocrat. Purchases, sales, births, deaths, and punishments, all noted in the same flat, unornamented hand. His wife, a woman named Cecilia, her name was Dorothea, daughter of a rice merchant from Beaufort, married into the Harrove name in 1843 at the age of 19. She bore 3 children, of whom 2 survived. She is described in a letter from a neighboring planter's wife as quiet, devout, and rather more fond of her garden than her dining room. She appears rarely in Nathaniel's ledgers, and almost never in the surviving letters. Whatever she knew about what happened at Harlow Hall, she carried with her to the grave in 1891. The eldest surviving Harrove child, a son named Warren, was 23 years old when the war ended. He had served 2 years in the Confederate Army before a fever sent him home in 1863, and he had spent the remainder of the conflict managing the estate under the increasing strain of the blockade, the collapse of markets, and the slow dissolution of the entire system on which everything depended. When emancipation came, Warren handled it like a man who had already accepted the outcome while refusing to acknowledge its implications. He offered wages, a few cents a day, to any formerly enslaved person willing to stay. Most left. A handful remained, either because they had nowhere else to go, or because Harlow Hall was, in a way they could not fully explain, still theirs. By 1868, Warren Harrove was deep in debt. The rice market had collapsed. The fields needed repairs he could not afford. Several outbuildings had fallen into disuse, and the main house, despite its white paint and imposing height, had begun to show the particular decay that sets in when maintenance is deferred year after year, a softening of the wood, a darkening of the mortar, a smell that no open window could fully dispel. He sold the estate in March of 1869 to a man named Gerald Apprentice, a wholesale merchant from Philadelphia who had made a considerable fortune supplying Union forces during the war and was now looking to invest in Southern land. Apprentice had never laid eyes on the property before the day he bought it. He had acted on the recommendation of a business associate who described it as distressed but structurally sound, with significant potential. The price was less than half of what comparable acreage had sold for a decade earlier. Warren Harrove took the money, settled his most pressing debts, and relocated to Savannah. He died there in 1884. His obituary described him as a man of the Old South, faithful to its traditions. His mother, Dorothea, declined to attend his funeral, citing poor health. She was 70 years old at the time and had not left Beaufort in 3 years. Her reasons for staying away were never formally recorded. Gerald Apprentice arrived at Harlow Hall in April of 1869 with considerable optimism and almost no understanding of what he had actually purchased. The carpenter's name was Daniel Foss, a man in his late 40s who had followed Apprentice south from Pennsylvania on the strength of good wages and a promise of steady work through the summer. He was experienced, practical, and by all accounts not given to nervousness or superstition. He had worked in old houses before. He knew the sounds they made, the way old wood settles and shifts in the heat. He was not, as he put it in a letter to his wife, the sort to be frightened by shadows. He began the renovation in the east wing of the main house, which showed the worst structural damage and which Apprentice wanted addressed before the summer humidity made things worse. The plan was straightforward: remove the damaged plaster from the interior walls, assess the framing, repair what could be repaired, and replace what could not. Standard work for a man of his experience. The first wall he opened was in a room on the second floor, a room that, from its dimensions and location above the main entryway, appeared to have been used as a study or small library. The walls were paneled in painted pine over a plaster substrate. When Foss began pulling the panels away from the southern wall, he found something he initially assumed was the remnant of an old modification. A section of the framing, roughly 2 feet wide and extending from floor to ceiling, had been packed tightly with material that was neither insulation nor structural infill. It was paper. Not loose paper, not scattered, but paper that had been compressed, folded, rolled, and forced into every available space inside that cavity between the exterior wall and the interior surface. Hundreds of pieces. Maybe more. When Foss pulled the first bundle free, it crumbled partially in his hands, the edges rotted by moisture and age, but the center of each piece, protected by the compression, remained largely intact. The ink was faded but still legible. They were letters. Or rather, pieces of letters, fragments of correspondence, strips of paper covered in handwriting that ranged from a careful, educated script to something that was clearly the effort of someone who had learned to write under difficult circumstances, letters varying in size and pressure, as though the hand holding the pen had been uncertain of its right to do so. Foss, who was literate but no scholar, read enough of what he held to understand that what he had found was not simply correspondence that had been forgotten. The paper had been placed there deliberately, forcefully, as though someone had needed very badly to ensure that what was written on it never left that house, and had chosen the most permanent means of disposal available to them. He showed the papers to Apprentice that evening. Apprentice, by his own account, read 3 of the fragments before setting them down on his work table and sitting in silence for a long time. He later described the experience to his attorney in Philadelphia as discovering that the house you've purchased was built on something other than foundation stones. What those letters contained in full would not become clear for weeks. But the fragments Foss had retrieved that first afternoon were enough to establish certain things with certainty. The letters were addressed to multiple recipients. Some were addressed to specific individuals. Some to unnamed recipients described only by role or location. Several mentioned dates spanning from the early 1840s through the mid-1860s. And one, the one Apprentice read last, a strip of paper that had been torn diagonally, as though in haste, contained a single sentence that would stay with him for the rest of his life. They do not know we keep count. Apprentice did not contact the authorities immediately. This was not, as he would later explain it, out of any desire to conceal what he had found. It was rather that he was genuinely uncertain what authority had jurisdiction over letters hidden in a wall, or what law, if any, had been violated by their concealment. The war had ended 4 years ago. Emancipation was the law. The world that had produced those documents was, legally speaking, finished. And yet, he had Foss continue opening the walls. Over the following 2 weeks, they found similar caches in 4 additional locations within the main house, behind the plaster of the ground floor kitchen passageway, inside the frame of a sealed doorway on the 3rd floor that had been plastered over so completely that no trace of its former existence was visible from either side, within the hollow base of a built-in cabinet in what had been the overseer's office at the rear of the house, and most surprisingly, beneath the floorboards of the cupola, the small observation room at the very top of the house, where the boards had been pried up and replaced with a precision that suggested the work had been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had taken the time to do it carefully. The materials were not identical across all the locations. The kitchen passageway yielded mostly small objects, not letters, but items that had been carefully wrapped in cloth before being hidden, a brass button engraved on its reverse with initials that were not Harov initials, a folded piece of cloth that appeared to be a portion of a garment, too deteriorated to identify with certainty but of a weight and weave consistent with workwear from the mid-19th century, 3 coins, 2 American and 1 apprentice could not identify, and a small wooden disc, smooth on one side and carved on the other with a pattern none of the men on the renovation crew could name. The sealed doorway on the 3rd floor opened onto a space that was neither a room nor a passage. It was a cavity perhaps 4 feet wide and 7 feet long that existed between the exterior wall of the house and an interior partition with no evident structural purpose. The space had been used. The floor showed clear evidence of long occupation, a worn depression in the boards, dark discoloration from what might have been a lamp or candle, a pattern of scratch marks along the lower section of the inner wall that appeared, on close examination, to be a deliberate tally. Hundreds of vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, covering an area roughly 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Someone had been counting something methodically, patiently, over what appeared, based on the variation in depth and angle of the marks, to have been a very long time. The cabinet in the overseer's office contained a different kind of material entirely. What Apprentice found there were not letters and not objects, but what appeared to be a record, a parallel ledger maintained in a hand that was careful and consistent, recording information in a format that deliberately echoed the plantation's official accounts. Column after column of dates, names, quantities, and notations, but not the names from Nathaniel Harov's ledgers. Different names. Some of them given names that appeared nowhere in the official records. Others described by relationship rather than name. The woman brought from the Beaufort auction. Her daughter. The child born in October not recorded. The entries were meticulous. They covered a period from approximately 1848 to 1863, when the handwriting abruptly changed, becoming slightly less certain, slightly larger, as though the person who had maintained the record had passed the responsibility to someone else. The final cache, beneath the cupola floor, was the most difficult to interpret. The papers there were more deteriorated than the others, the moisture damage more severe, the rot more advanced. Apprentice and Foss spent 2 days carefully separating and drying what could be salvaged. What remained legible when the process was complete were fragments of what appeared to be a single long document, not a collection of separate letters, but a continuous narrative written in a hand that was both highly educated and clearly not the hand of anyone in the Harov family records Apprentice had been given with the deed. The narrative was in English, but it was not the English of the period's official documents. It was the English of someone who had learned the language under specific conditions, who had absorbed it, mastered it, and then used it with a precision that was, in its own way, a kind of defiance. Apprentice could only read fragments. But what he read was enough to tell him that the document was, among other things, a chronicle, a deliberate, systematic account of events at Harlow Hall spanning what appeared to be the entire antebellum period of the property's operation. He contacted his attorney in Philadelphia on a Thursday evening in late May of 1869. The letter he sent was 7 pages long. His attorney, a man named Edmund Hartwell, who had handled Apprentice's business affairs for 15 years, received it on a Monday and made an immediate trip south. He arrived at Harlow Hall on a Wednesday. By that evening, he and Apprentice had agreed on one thing: what they had found was not simply the detritus of a history now concluded. It was a record that someone had very deliberately preserved. And the question neither man could answer, the question that would come to define the next 3 years of their lives, was a simple one: preserved for whom? Hartwell, who had practiced law in Philadelphia for 20 years and possessed a historian's instinct for documentation, immediately recognized that the materials found at Harlow Hall were not simply historically significant. They were legally complex in ways the American legal system of 1869 was entirely unprepared to address. The parallel ledger was the most immediately actionable document. It recorded systematically, and with considerable specificity, a series of practices at Harlow Hall that, even under the legal framework of the antebellum South, had been of questionable legality, and that, under post-war law, pointed toward a set of facts powerful men in South Carolina would prefer remained buried. Chief among these was the question of the unrecorded. The official Harrove ledgers, copies of which Apprentice had received with the deed, showed a consistent enslaved population at the property, numbers that more or less matched the taxes and registration records the Harrove family had filed with the county. But the parallel ledger told a different story. It recorded a systematic practice, spanning at least 15 years, the deliberate non-registration of certain individuals, particularly children born on the property, who were instead sold privately and without official record. Transactions that generated income for the Harrove estate without leaving any trace in the official documentation. This was not in itself a revelation about the brutality of the system. The practice of unrecorded transactions was well understood by anyone who had studied the period. What made the Harlow Hall ledger remarkable was its specificity. It recorded not just the existence of these transactions, but their details, prices, dates, the names of buyers, and, in some cases, brief notations about the individuals sold. These notations were not the detached accounting entries of Nathaniel Harrove's official records. They were something else entirely, brief, compressed, written in a shorthand that Hartwell and Apprentice spent several days learning to interpret. The key to the shorthand was found in the cupola fragments. What they had initially taken to be a continuous narrative was actually two interwoven documents, a chronicle of events at Harlow Hall and a cipher key, a systematic record of the notation system used in the parallel ledger. The cipher was not complex by cryptographic standards. It was the kind of system developed by someone who needed to communicate information clearly to a specific known readership while keeping it illegible to anyone outside that group. The notation that had appeared throughout the ledger as a simple dash following a name, for example, meant, departed alive, destination recorded elsewhere. A small circle meant, died on property, cause unrecorded. A horizontal line through a name meant, sold without family knowledge. When Hartwell applied the cipher to the full ledger, the document transformed. It was not simply an accounting record. It was a map, a systematic chart of where people had gone. Not the vague approximations of official records, but specific information about buyers, locations, and in some cases, subsequent sales. Information that, if it had ever reached the people it concerned, would have allowed families separated by the trade to know where their relatives had been taken. This was what, "they do not know we keep count," had meant. Someone at Harlow Hall, someone with access to both the official records and the transactions that never appeared in them, had been maintaining a parallel archive for over a decade. Not as evidence for any court. Not as ammunition for any formal challenge. But as a record kept against the possibility that it might one day be of use to the people it documented. Hartwell sat with this understanding for a long time before he spoke. "Someone in that house," he said to Apprentice on an evening in early June, with the Carolina heat pressing through the unrestored windows, "understood exactly what was happening. And they understood it would matter eventually, even if they had no way to know how or when." Apprentice asked the question that had been forming in his mind for days. Who had that kind of access? Who could have maintained this without being discovered? Hartwell had already been thinking about this. The answer, he had concluded, was not a single person. The handwriting in the ledger changed twice over its 15-year span, subtly, but unmistakably. At least 3 individuals had contributed to its maintenance. And based on the nature of the information recorded, at least one of them had to have had access to Nathaniel Harrove's own records, either directly or through someone who did. The official Harrove household accounts included a notation, found in the ledgers transferred with the deed, of a woman described as the house manager. Trained in correspondence and accounts. Employed from 1845. She is referred to throughout the ledger only as Nora. No surname. No age. No origin. She appears in the official records only in the context of her function, managing the household, maintaining supply inventories, occasionally recording the receipt of payments from buyers who came to the house directly rather than through formal channels. She does not appear in the ledger after February of 1863. The significance of that date would not become clear until Hartwell made a trip in the summer of 1869 to a Freedmen's Bureau office in Columbia, one of the federal agencies established after the war to assist formerly enslaved people in establishing legal identities, locating family members, and navigating the transition to freedom. The Bureau's records were incomplete, underfunded, and overwhelmed by the scale of the need they were attempting to address. But they contained something that no one had thought to connect to Harlow Hall until Hartwell walked in with the parallel ledger under his arm and asked to see the registration records for women who had come through the Columbia office in 1865 and 1866. He found 4 registrations that matched names from the ledger. 3 were straightforward, individuals whose histories could be partially reconstructed from the Bureau's documents and the ledger's notations. The 4th was different. She had registered under the name Nora Hale. She had listed her former location as a rice plantation, Lowland County, South Carolina, vague by Bureau standards, which suggested she had reasons not to be specific. She had listed her skills as household management, accounting, written correspondence. And she had listed her age in 1866 as 41, which would have made her approximately 19 in 1845. The year the official Harrove ledger first noted the arrival of the house manager trained in correspondence and accounts. Hartwell found no address for Nora Hale in the Bureau records. She had registered, received her documentation, and then, as far as the Bureau's records could determine, moved on. Her destination was not recorded. The Bureau agent who had processed her registration had noted in the margin of her file a single observation, unusually precise in her account. Gave no names of former owners. Appeared aware of legal implications. She had been gone for 3 years before Apprentice bought the house. She had left behind a record she almost certainly knew would one day be found. The question was whether she had intended it to be found by someone like Apprentice, or whether she had hidden it for someone who never came. The deeper Hartwell dug, the more the contours of what had happened at Harlow Hall began to take a shape that was both clearer and more troubling. In the late summer of 1869, he traveled to Charleston and spent 2 weeks in the records of the county courthouse, cross-referencing the Harrove family's official transaction records against property transfers, estate inventories, and court filings from the period covered by the parallel ledger. He was looking for the buyers, the names recorded in the ledger cipher, the men who had come to Harlow Hall and left with individuals who appeared in no official record. Some of the names he could not trace. They appeared in no Charleston records, no county filings, no newspaper archives. They had purchased people at Harlow Hall and vanished as completely as the people they had bought. Whether this was because they had operated entirely outside the legal system, or because records from certain counties had been destroyed during the war, or because the names recorded in the ledger were aliases rather than legal names, Hartwell could not determine with certainty. But other names were traceable. And several of them were significant. One appeared 4 times in the ledger, each time associated with a transaction involving a child rather than an adult. This buyer is listed in the ledger cipher notation as someone who paid above market rate and required no documentation. The name, when Hartwell located it in the Charleston records, belonged to a man who had served as a county commissioner during the 1850s, and who was, as of 1869, still alive. Now serving on the board of a charitable society established in 1866 to assist formerly enslaved people in finding employment. Hartwell did not publish this finding. He did not take it to any court. The legal framework for addressing transactions that had been illegal even under antebellum law, conducted by men who were now protected by both time and social position, was essentially non-existent in 1869 South Carolina. To bring such a finding forward publicly would have required a political will that was, in that particular moment of Reconstruction, being actively dismantled. What he did instead was write it all down. He compiled a comprehensive document, a synthesis of the parallel ledger, the cipher key, the letter fragments, the Bureau records, and his own research findings, that he titled, with a lawyer's dry precision, A Record of Certain Transactions and Their Documentation, Harlow Hall Plantation, South Carolina, 1845 to 1863. He made 3 copies. One he kept. One he sent to a colleague at a law firm in Boston who had expressed interest in the legal questions raised by the post-war period. And one, the original documents themselves, along with a summary of his findings, he sent to an address in Philadelphia that Apprentice had located through a separate chain of inquiry. The address belonged to a woman named Constance Lyle, who operated a small school for the education of black children in the 7th Ward. Apprentice had found her name through a contact at the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, which had not formally dissolved after the war but had redirected its efforts toward education and legal advocacy. Someone at the society, someone Apprentice described in a letter to Hartwell only as, a woman who seemed to know exactly what I was describing before I finished describing it, had given him Constance Lyle's name and address. He had not known, when he sent the documents, whether they would mean anything to her. He had not known whether Nora Hale had ever been in contact with the Philadelphia community, or whether the records sent there would find anyone who could make use of them. The letter he received back from Constance Lyle arrived 6 weeks later. It was brief. It said only that she had received the materials and would ensure they reached the people they concerned. It gave no further details. It was signed at the bottom, in a hand that Apprentice recognized from the parallel ledger. Not Constance Lyle's hand. Someone else's. Apprentice stared at that signature for a long time. He had last seen that handwriting on papers that had been hidden inside a wall for years, perhaps decades, papers concealed so thoroughly that their discovery had required the complete dismantling of the room around them. And now the same hand had signed a letter in his parlor in South Carolina in 1869, as though the wall had never existed. He wrote back immediately. His letter asked only one question: are the families being found? The answer arrived 3 months later. It was not a letter. It was a list. 4 pages handwritten, with names and locations for 43 individuals whose whereabouts had been unknown to their families since the transactions recorded in the parallel ledger. Some had been located in Georgia, in Alabama, in Mississippi. Several had been found within South Carolina itself, in counties less than 100 miles from Harlow Hall. 3 had died, their deaths confirmed through bureau records and local testimony. 11 could not yet be located. At the bottom of the list, beneath the final name, was a single line that functioned simultaneously as a conclusion and as an indictment: this is what they thought they had destroyed. Apprentice kept his silence about the documents for 2 years after that list arrived. This was not cowardice, though there were men in his position who would have burned everything out of straightforward self-interest. The documents were not legally his. They had been left in the walls by people whose descendants he was now in contact with, and their disposition was not properly his to decide. And the political climate in South Carolina in the early 1870s was not one in which documents of this kind could be introduced into any public forum without significant risk to the people they concerned. Reconstruction was collapsing. The federal presence in the South, which had for a brief period created a framework within which formerly enslaved people exercised political rights and held public office, was being systematically dismantled by campaigns of terror and fraud that were official in everything but name. The men who had purchased children at Harlow Hall were not worried about being called to account. They were, in several cases, in positions of renewed authority. It was in this context, in the autumn of 1871, that a man came to Harlow Hall looking for Gerald Apprentice. He arrived without advance notice on a Tuesday afternoon in October, accompanied by 2 other men who waited in the road while he walked to the house. He introduced himself to Apprentice's housekeeper, a local woman named Agnes, as a representative of the Haro family interests, and asked to speak with the owner of the property. Apprentice was in the East Wing when Agnes came to find him. She relayed the man's introduction in a flat, careful voice that told Apprentice everything he needed to know about her reading of the situation. He went to meet the visitor. The man's name was Thane. He gave only the single name, which may or may not have been his actual name. He was well-dressed, approximately 50 years old, with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to having his requests interpreted as directives. He spoke pleasantly and without overt threat. He said that he had been made aware, through mutual acquaintances, that Mr. Apprentice had discovered certain materials during the renovation of the property, and that these materials were of a sensitive nature. He said that the Haro family, and he used that phrase several times, had a natural interest in ensuring that private family correspondence did not find its way into circulation. He said that he would be happy to relieve Mr. Apprentice of the burden of storing such materials, and that a suitable arrangement could certainly be reached. Apprentice listened without interrupting. Then he told Thane that the materials he was describing had already been transferred to a secure location outside South Carolina. That copies existed in multiple hands. And that any attempt to recover or suppress them would have the opposite of the intended effect. Thane's pleasantness did not change, but something in his expression shifted, a very small recalibration, like a man updating a calculation. He said he would convey Mr. Apprentice's position to the relevant parties. He thanked Apprentice for his time. He walked back to the road, spoke briefly with the two men waiting there, and left. Apprentice wrote to Hartwell that same evening. He wrote to Constance Lyle the following morning. He did not sleep well for several weeks after that. What Thane's visit confirmed, what Apprentice had already suspected but had not known with certainty until that afternoon, was that someone connected to the Harrove family's former interests had known about the materials for some time. Not since Apprentice had begun sending documents north. Before that. The visit had come too quickly, with too much specific knowledge, to have been assembled from information gathered after the documents left South Carolina. Which meant that someone had known about the parallel ledger while it was still inside the wall. The implications of this were not at first obvious. It took Apprentice several days, in consultation with Hartwell by correspondence, to work through what it meant. If someone had known about the ledger's existence, had known it was hidden, had known it documented the unrecorded transactions, and had not destroyed it, had simply left it there when the property was sold, then one of two things was true. Either the knowledge had been held by someone who wanted the ledger found by whoever bought the house. Or it had been held by someone who was afraid to destroy it, someone who understood that the information in it was known to people outside the walls of Harlow Hall, and who feared that its destruction would not suppress the record, but only confirm their awareness of it. Warren Harrove had sold the estate in March of 1869. He had been living on it, managing it, since the end of the war in 1865. He had spent 4 years as the sole occupant of a house whose walls contained a detailed record of crimes committed on his family's property, crimes that implicated directly and by name men who were still alive and still connected to the social and political infrastructure of South Carolina. Had he found the ledger himself? Had someone told him it was there? Hartwell traveled to Savannah in the spring of 1872 to find out. Warren Harrove agreed to meet him, which surprised Hartwell. He had expected to be refused. Instead, Harrove received him in a sitting room in the boarding house where he was then living, a modest space that represented a considerable decline from the world of Harlow Hall, and poured him a glass of whiskey without being asked. Hartwell asked his questions directly. He was a lawyer. He did not believe in circling the point. Harrove was silent for a long time after the last question. He looked at the glass in his hand rather than at Hartwell. When he finally spoke, he said, "I found it in 1866. In January. I'd been trying to fix the stove in the kitchen passage, and a section of the plaster came away. I read what I could. I understood what it was." Hartwell asked what he had done with that knowledge. Harrove said nothing. Hartwell asked why. Harrove said, "Because she was already gone. And because, if I had told anyone, the people whose names were in there, the buyers, they'd have burned the house to the ground with me in it, most likely." Hartwell asked whether that was the reason he had sold the property. Another long silence. "Then, I sold it because I couldn't live in it. I would wake up at 3 in the morning, and I could hear the house, not sounds, not settling, or wind, I knew what was in the walls. I knew what it meant. And I could not stop knowing." Hartwell asked him one final question: had he sold the property to Apprentice specifically, or had Apprentice simply been the first willing buyer? Harrove looked up from his glass for the first time during the conversation. His expression was difficult to read, something between guilt and a very old, very tired form of calculation. He said, "I made inquiries before I listed it. About the sort of man he was." Hartwell returned to Philadelphia with his notes and the full weight of what he now understood. Warren Harrove had not sold Harlow Hall to escape his debts. He had sold it because he had found the ledger and had understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 4 years alone in a house full of evidence, that the only way to ensure the documents survived was to put them in the hands of someone who would not destroy them. Someone from outside the South. Someone with enough distance from the system to read what the records contained without needing to suppress them. He had engineered the discovery. Not out of guilt, exactly. Not out of justice, exactly. Out of something more complicated and more human than either, a recognition that the ledger's existence was not his burden to carry and not his right to bury, and that the only moral act available to him was to create the conditions under which someone else could make a decision he was incapable of making himself. Whether this made Warren Harrove a coward, or something approaching a collaborator in the ledger's survival, was a question Hartwell never answered definitively. He laid out the facts. He let the questions stand. The document that Hartwell published in 1874, not a legal brief, not a court filing, but a historical monograph distributed through a small press in Boston, was titled, Hidden Record, The Harlow Hall Documents and the Unregistered Trade in South Carolina, 1845 to 1863. It contained a full transcription of the parallel ledger, with the cipher key explained, and a summary of the research conducted between 1869 and 1873. It named names where names were known. It documented transactions where transactions could be traced. It did not produce any legal action. The men named in it as buyers were, by 1874, either dead or sufficiently protected by the political landscape of Reconstruction's collapse to be beyond reach. The county commissioner who had purchased children from Harlow Hall above market rate. He had died in 1871, before Hartwell's monograph was complete. Whether this was fortunate for him, or simply the natural end of a long life, was a matter of perspective. The monograph sold fewer than 300 copies in its first year. It was reviewed in 2 northern newspapers and 1 abolitionist journal, all favorably. In South Carolina, it was not reviewed at all. Gerald Apprentice never converted Harlow Hall into what he had imagined when he bought it. The renovations continued sporadically through the 1870s, but the ambition of the original project, to transform the estate into something modern, something clean, never quite materialized. He sold the property in 1878 at a small loss to a timber company primarily interested in the acreage rather than the house. The house itself stood empty for several years before being damaged by a fire of undetermined origin in 1883. It was not rebuilt. The parallel ledger, the original document, was retained by Constance Lyle's school in Philadelphia until 1891, when it was transferred to a historically black college in the South at the request of a woman who had been a student at the school in the 1870s. The transfer was accompanied by a letter written in a hand that, by 1891, had grown slightly unsteady with age, but was still unmistakably the same hand that had maintained the record for 15 years inside a wall at Harlow Hall, and had signed the letter to Gerald Apprentice in 1869. And had sent the list of 43 names across the distance between what had been hidden and what was at last beginning to be known. Nora Hale's final letter, written alongside the ledger's transfer, was brief. She did not explain what she had done or why. She did not ask to be thanked or remembered. She said only that the record was complete. That every name she had been able to account for had been accounted for. That the 11 who had not been found in 1869 had, in the 20 years since, been reduced to 3. That 3 remained unknown was, she wrote, not a failure. It is a remaining obligation. She signed her name. She gave no date. The ledger entered the college's archive and remained there, largely unexamined, for decades. And that is where the story might have ended. On an archive shelf in a building most people would never visit, holding a record most people would never read. But records do not end simply because the people who created them are gone. In the spring of 1924, a history professor at the college was cataloging materials in the archive when he opened a box that had not been opened in 20 years. He found the ledger. He found the cipher key. He found Nora Hale's letter tucked inside the front cover. He spent 3 months with the materials before he published anything. And when he did, in a small journal of American history, in a modest article that attracted little attention at the time, he closed his essay with a sentence that has stayed in the margins of the historical record ever since. The most remarkable thing about the Harlow Hall record, he wrote, is not what it documents. It is the evidence it provides of the systematic, sustained, and entirely clandestine effort by enslaved people to maintain knowledge of their own history in conditions designed specifically to prevent them from doing so. These documents were not created for posterity. They were created for the people they named. They were hidden not to be discovered by strangers, but to be found by those who were meant to find them. And then, when circumstance made that impossible, they waited, with the patient authority of all things that refused to be entirely erased, for whoever came next. The walls of Harlow Hall are gone now. The timber company that bought the land in 1878 dismantled whatever the fire of 1883 had left standing, and the earth where the house once sat has long since been reclaimed by the low Carolina scrub that grows across everything in that region if left undisturbed for long enough. There is no marker. There is no sign. But in an archive in the South, in a building built specifically to hold the history the official record refused to carry, the ledger still exists. The names in it are still legible. The cipher is still readable. The tally marks on the wall of the sealed room are gone with the house, but the record of their existence is not. They do not know we keep count. they were right. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was finally revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this account and want more forgotten stories from American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves the truth hidden behind closed doors.